fallen upon hard times. In earlier days, it had been a great order, but as a result of anti-monastic persecution in the 17th and the 18th centuries, and then the rise of secularism in the 19th century, all of its branch houses were lost, and it had become reduced to the point where there were only 5 monks left in the decaying mother house, which encompassed the abbot and 4 others, all over the age of 70. Clearly, it was a dying order. In the deep woods surrounding the monastery, there was a hermitage. As the abbot agonized over the imminent death of his order, it occurred to him to visit the hermitage and ask if by some possible chance the hermit could offer any advice that might save the monastery. The hermit welcomed the abbot at his hut, but when the abbot explained the purpose of his visit, the hermit could only empathize with him. "I know how it is," he exclaimed. "The spirit has gone out of all the people. It's the same in all of the nearby towns." So the old abbot and the hermit commiserated together. Soon the time came when the abbot had to leave. He embraced the hermit and he said, "It's been a wonderful thing that we should meet after all these years, but I have still failed in my purpose for coming here. Is there nothing you can tell me, no piece of advice you can give me that would help me to save my dying order?" "No, I'm sorry," the hermit responded. "I have no advice to give. The only thing I can tell you is that the Messiah is one of you." When the abbot returned to the monastery, his fellow monks gathered around him to ask, "Well, what did the hermit say?" "He couldn't help," the abbot answered. "We just commiserated and read the scriptures together. But he did say one thing just as I was leaving. He said that the Messiah is one of us. I don't know what he meant." In the days and the weeks and the months that followed, the old monks pondered these words and wondered whether there was any possible significance. The Messiah is one of us? Could he have possibly meant one of us monks here at the monastery? If that's the case, which one? Do you suppose he meant the abbot? Yeah, if he meant anyone, he probably meant the abbot. He's been our leader for more than a generation. On the other hand, he might have meant Brother Thomas. Certainly Brother Thomas is a holy man. Everyone knows that Thomas is a man of light. Certainly he could not have meant Brother Elred. Elred gets crotchety at times. But come to think of it, even though he is a thorn in people's sides, when you look back on it, Elred is virtually always right, often very right. Maybe the hermit did mean Brother Elred, but surely not Brother Philip. Philip is so passive, a real nobody. But then, almost mysteriously, he has a gift for somehow always being there when you need him. He just magically appears by your side. Maybe Philip is the Messiah. Of course, the hermit didn't mean me. He couldn't possibly have meant me. I'm just an ordinary person. Yet supposing he did. Supposing I am the Messiah. Oh, God, not me. I couldn't be that much for you, could I? As they contemplated in this manner, the old monks began to treat each other with extraordinary respect on the off chance that one of them might be the Messiah. And on the off chance that each monk himself might be the Messiah, they began to treat themselves with extraordinary respect. Because the forest in which it was situated was beautiful, it so happened that people still occasionally came to visit the monastery to picnic on to wander along some of its paths, and even every now and then to go into the dilapidated chapel to meditate. As they did so, without even being conscious of it, they sensed the aura of extraordinary respect that now began to surround the 5 old monks and seemed to radiate out from them and permeate the atmosphere of the place. There was something strangely attractive, even compelling about it. Hardly knowing why, they began to come back to the monastery more frequently to picnic, to play, and to pray. They began to bring their friends to show them this special place, and their friends brought their friends. Then it happened that some of the younger men who came to visit the monastery started to talk more and more with the old monks. After a while, one of them asked if he could join them, then another, and another. So within a few years, the monastery had once again become a thriving order, and thanks to the hermit's gift, a vibrant center of light and spirituality in the entire realm. This past week, I had a bit of a struggle with this parable of the sheep and the goats. As a rule, most of us prefer not to spend a whole lot of time and energy worrying about Judgment Day, and I am certainly no exception. There are a lot of reasons for this, but I think in most cases it's because we've all pretty much had our fill of judgment. Judgment from other people, threats of judgment from God. Many of us have religious backgrounds where threats of damnation have been used to control our behavior. I know I've told my own stories about it, and I've heard from many of you of similar experiences. We're all weary of judgment and Judgment Day talk, and we just don't want to hear it anymore. Yet, after a long journey through Jesus' parables about the kingdom of heaven and what it is like, here we are at the end of our tour with this story about judgment. As I prepared for this sermon on the sheep and the goats, I spent a lot of time looking through commentary, and I gained all sorts of insight that I didn't have before. For instance, the sheep and the goats in Jesus' time were very hard to tell apart. It's a lot like the wheat and the weeds that grew together. The sheep and the goats may be in the same pasture, but sorting them out is a job for the master shepherd. And the moral of that message would be that no person is qualified to judge. Another insight I gained has to do with verse 32, which talks about the nations being gathered before him, and he will separate people from one another. There are a lot of arguments that the word people is not the right translation. It should read them. If the word is them, then it would follow that it is the nations that are being separated into the sheep and the goats, not individuals. Older versions, like King James, use the word them. But newer translations, such as the NRSV and the NIV, actually change the entire meaning of the parable by rendering it as people. And that might seem like a small thing, but changing the translation makes it possible to shift our focus from the fate of nations to the fate of individuals in the afterlife. So instead of a parable that judges the politics and the economics of empires, we get a parable that supports empires by playing the same game of sorting people into us versus them. Then there is the question of who. Who is Jesus referring to specifically if he is talking about nations? Is he talking about the Gentiles, or is he talking about the Jews, or is he talking about both? And who exactly are the least of these that the goats didn't bother to help? And then, since Jesus is talking about judgment based on concrete actions, and since we do a ton of concrete actions throughout every day, much less a lifetime, How does this work for the times we have served others and the times we have neglected others? How many times do we have to be neglectful before we're sent into punishment? You see what I mean? This parable was really starting to give me a theological headache. But when I put it into context with the rest of Matthew's gospel, it actually started to make a lot of sense. Because the first thing you notice is that Matthew's gospel is not about judgment. It's not about sorting out sheep and goats or wheat and weeds. Those are just illustrations to support a much bigger point. In this passage, what Jesus seems to be saying is that if there is any sort of final judgment, then the criteria on which you will be judged will be what you have actually done or neglected to do for the less fortunate. Specifically, whether you have helped feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, welcomed the stranger, clothed the naked, and visited the sick and the imprisoned. And that brings us full circle right back to where Jesus began his ministry with the words, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." From those first words spoken on a hill all the way to Jerusalem, where he spoke about the end of times, Jesus' message has been crystal clear. If you want to see the kingdom of heaven, then wake up and start taking care of each other. And in this particular passage, Jesus brings it home. When we serve others, we are serving Jesus himself. Truly, I tell you, however you treat the least of my sisters or brothers is how you have treated me. This parable is not complex. The sheep and the goats were separated over one and only one criteria: how they treated the least of these. That's it. Nothing more. And here's the surprising part of the story. The sheep didn't even know that doing this would give them reward. Think about that. The goats were goats because they were seeking their own reward. The sheep are sheep because they were simply loving everybody because it's the right thing to do. Once the goats find out that getting the reward is about doing right by the least of these, then they begin trying to define the least of these so they can start serving them. Why? Because that's how they get the reward. And as soon as that becomes the motivation, then guess what? You're a goat. The kingdom of heaven isn't about thrones or power or getting in. The kingdom of heaven is about loving everyone because that is the right thing to do. Ultimately, we are all the least of these, and we are all equal in the eyes of God. This parable is not about judgment handed out by some remote supreme being sitting on a throne up there above the clouds. It's about God right here in the messiness and the ambiguity of human life. God right here, particularly in the neighbor who needs you. If you want to see the face of God, look into the face of one of the least of these, the vulnerable, the weak, the children. Or look in the mirror, because sometimes we too are hungry or thirsty, wandering or lost, sick in body or in spirit. Oftentimes we fail to see the Christ that dwells within us all. It's not intentional. We're human. We get caught up in life and we forget. Serving Christ through serving the poorest among us is a practice. Affirming the light of God in all people is a disposition and a set of behaviors that must be cultivated and carried out over time. The day-to-day practice of compassion and of love toward your neighbors, all of them, is more difficult than anything else we'll ever do. but it is also the most important thing of all. Jesus was very clear about that. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from all of this today, it is this: the Messiah is one of us. May it be with you all, according to God's word. Amen.